Welcome to the virtual lunch. Today is Friday, September 10th, and this is virtual lunch number 389. Our guest today is Joe Polizzotto, the Senior Vice President for Strategy and Client Services at QuisLex. He is the former General Counsel for the Americas at Deutsche Bank and also the former General Counsel at Lehman Brothers. This is, of course, part of our continuing series on the future of law with QuisLex. Hi, Joe. How are you?
I'm great, Ari.
I'm excited for this opportunity. So, Joe, tell us about your background and your role at QuisLex.
I was a big firm litigator for about 10 years. And then in 1989, I made a move in-house and I joined Shearson Lehman Brothers. I was asked to manage a group of 10 lawyers in what was a very large litigation department at the time. Shearson Lehman Brothers ultimately became Lehman Brothers when the Shearson division of Lehman Brothers was sold to Smith Barney back in the 90s, for those of you who remember that. And I stayed behind and remained at the time as the head of litigation and regulatory at Lehman. And then in 1999, I was made the global GC of the firm. And I had a bunch of other responsibilities there too, including compliance, corporate audit, and also something called transaction management, which was a group that documented our derivatives transactions. I did that, and it was at Lehman until the bitter end. About 4 months after Lehman, I started to talk to and then ultimately accepted a job as the head of the legal function for the Americas for Deutsche Bank. It was at Deutsche Bank where I got to know QuisLex, and I wound up spending a fair amount of time taking a deeper dive into what QuisLex was doing. And over the course of this almost 6 years I was there, I saw time and again how impactful having a close relationship with an alternative legal services provider like QuisLex could be in my business and in my role. I left the bank and then rekindled a relationship with Ram Vasudevan, our CEO. One thing led to another. And about almost 2 years after I left the bank, after having done some consulting, I joined QuisLex as a senior advisor to Ram. And I do a combination of strategy and business development for them. We do a lot of M&A work, mostly, obviously, contract due diligence. And we get brought in to assist outside lawyers and in-house counsel in those tasks. One thing the remote environment has taught us all is that we can function remotely, right? And so you have to try to establish connectivity as great as you can. And by connectivity, I mean one-on-one human connections with your internal clients. And there may be a proliferation of Zoom meetings, but if you're not doing that, ultimately over time, that bond or that link is going to erode. And the clients are going to tend to view you almost as a machine or as a technological tool, as opposed to a human being with thinking and the ability to have an impact that goes beyond the mere execution of legal documents. The one thing I worry about in a remote environment is the front end, if you will, not forgetting to think about the legal function as a control function, because they will tend to see legal more as an execution function, because that's what they want to get out of legal. But a key part of what legal brings to the table is not just execution, but it's control, whether that's a cultural control or a reputational control. That link has to stay in place. And so to me, the danger in remote is that you tend to lose that over time. The big positive on remote is the ability to leverage technology in a way that many departments probably have never leveraged before and was probably needed. While there are many, many, many great companies that are extremely progressive in terms of adapting to the changes affected by big law, there are also a ton of companies that are still in the 20th century on how they're delivering legal services to their entities. For those latter companies in particular, hopefully this has been a bit of a learning event for them, and they've started to slowly move into the environment they should have moved into. I don't know a single law firm that had really solved the cultural conundrum. Many lawyers are miserable, particularly at the younger levels. The COVID crisis has given everyone an opportunity to reset. The smarter firms understood that the lawyers can be just as efficient. And if efficiency is measured by billable hours, clearly that's the case, being in a remote environment. But that, to me, clearly the best way to go forward would be through some hybrid method that provides the flexibility that prior to the event, younger lawyers haven't really had the opportunity to take advantage of, because the ability to not have to schlep into the office a couple of days a week, and to recognize particularly that the younger generation of lawyers really wants to work in the hours that they choose to work in. I think it's going to improve culture. It's going to be harder for the managements of the big firms to botch things up if they adapt to a more flexible work environment. People will feel better about working at a lot of these places. I get why the big banks and the big law firms want their lawyers coming back at least part of the time. It is very hard to train younger lawyers in particular in a totally remote environment. There's so much nuance you miss when you're just on a Zoom call. The Zoom call ends, and sometimes a lot of learning occurs after a client meeting ends. You might have an extra 5 minutes talking to a partner, and you're asking the partner, well, why did you say this or why did you say that? That's not something you can do as easily in a Zoom environment or in a totally remote environment. And so I get the fact that they need to come back to some extent. It just doesn't necessarily need to meet 5 days a week, in my view. So the article, which was fun to write and was a distillation of a talk I gave at the recent SIFMA conference, was focused on a certain aspect of team building, which is the necessity of building teams that are diverse. Not necessarily diverse in the traditional way in which we think about diversity, although that's certainly part of it, but also in terms of how different people approach problem solving and thinking and analytical analysis in a different way. You bring in a lawyer at a law firm and you say, oh, look, you're going to be managing 10 people in a large corporate environment. Well, I had, quote, managed associates in lawsuits where I was the senior lawyer handling the matters, but I hadn't really managed them in the sense of nurturing their careers as much or trying to assist in their development in the context of a broader organization. And so suddenly I had this management job. And the one thing I noticed early on is that there were some lawyers I naturally clicked with and others I didn't. And it wasn't because they weren't less smart or anything. In fact, many of them were among the smarter people I had. But it dawned on me that analytically, we had very different stylistic preferences in terms of how we problem solve. I came to realize that the more difficult relationships I had with some of the people who worked for me at the time were also among the most important ones for the company, because the quality of our decision making seemed to be better on some of the cases we were handling. And I took that to mean that because we came at matters from different perspectives, we were able collectively, through sometimes torturous conversations and meetings, to arrive at strategic alternatives that made more sense, as opposed to working with someone who thought precisely the way you thought and would quickly arrive at whatever thought you had in your head. And then you finish talking about the problem and talk about the last episode of whatever show you saw the night before. Over the course of my 30 some odd years, we've been talking about doing a better job, not just on our own with respect to diversity, but in terms of how we hire and retain outside counsel as well. The corporates and corporate law departments have, generally speaking, done a better job than certainly 30 years ago in that space. I'm not sure that many of the law firms have. The numbers bear that out. And I was signatory to some of these as well, for all of the efforts that people have made for good reasons to promote law firm diversity. Progress sometimes has been a lot slower than one might have hoped over the years. I would have thought there'd been more progress made than there has been in terms of weaning law firms away from the billable hour model. And frankly, the fault lies not with the law firms, but with corporates. Even though there's been a ton of talk about alternatives to legal billing, there hasn't been enough discipline on the corporate side to really make it happen in many instances. I don't blame the law firms. It's been the billable hour is a great model for them, but it's never been a perfect model, I don't think, for clients.
Joe Polizzotto, everybody. Well done, Joe. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Joe. This has been an inspiring conversation. I want to be respectful of your time. I'm grateful to you and, of course, to the folks at QuisLex for supporting our series on the future of law. I hope everyone has a great weekend.